I'm going to talk about Dutch artisans in the evil May Day riot of 1517. On the eve of May Day, following weeks of growing threats of xenophobic violence in the spring of 1517, rioting Londoners rose up in the night and attacked the homes and persons of strangers. From about 9 o'clock in the evening on the 30th of April, the rioters ran through the streets of the city, targeting immigrant enclaves, especially the precinct of the Collegiate Church of St. Martin le Grand. St. Martin's was an ecclesiastical liberty inside the walls of the city, just north of St. Paul's Cathedral. Its independent jurisdiction allowed stranger artisans to work there outside the London guild system. In the 1510s, it was densely populated with Dutch and French shoemakers and pouchmakers, making and selling their wares along St. Martin's Lane outside the aegis of the London guilds governing those crafts. That made St. Martin's the prime target for anti-immigrant resentment, according to both narrative accounts of the night of violence and the subsequent legal prosecution of the rioters. Today, I want to look at the stranger artisans, mostly Dutch, who lived in the precinct of St. Martin le Grand. I'm going to focus on what I've been able to piece together about the life of one of those Dutch artisans, a shoemaker named Peter Peterson. Within St. Martin's, each migrant had their own contextually shifting place in relation to the others around them, shaped by gender, age, occupational and household status, language, place of origin, length of time since migration, and personal networks. Their sense of attachment to and distance from the city around them was affected both by the quotidian interactions with those who lived around them and by moments of crisis, such as the riot that targeted them on the eve of May Day 1517. Peter Peterson was by no means typical, but looking closely at what we know about him helps to unlock some of the complications of the life of a Dutch stranger artisan in London in the early 16th century. Peter Peterson was born in the province of Holland about 1481 and first came to live in St. Martin le Grand when he was 11, about 1492. The St. Martin's precinct was about 1 hectare in size, think a football pitch or so. Though within the walls of the city, St. Martin's was nonetheless outside city jurisdiction. The Collegiate Church's properties had the status of a liberty, a legally and politically independent entity. Most of those who lived within the precinct by the time Peter Peterson arrived were stranger artisans who took advantage of the jurisdictional independence the liberty allowed them to work and sell outside the restrictive regulations of the London civic guilds. Though we don't know anything about Peter Peterson's parents, we can guess his father was a shoemaker or pouchmaker, the two dominant trades in the precinct. Apart from one short period, Peterson lived in St. Martin le Grand from this childhood arrival until his death in 1548. He became a shoemaker, so we can surmise he learned the craft in one of the shops on St. Martin's Lane. He couldn't have been formally apprenticed to a London shoemaker guildsman, as only boys born in England could be apprenticed in London. The Dutch artisans on St. Martin's Lane were likewise excluded from becoming guild members and from taking apprentices. To a Hollander, as Peterson was, however, neither of these exclusions would have seemed especially disabling, probably. Guilds were not a strong feature of artisanal life in the northern provinces of the Low Countries, and the highly structured and institutionalized 7-year apprenticeships that characterized English artisanal life were not at all the norm anywhere across the Channel. In the very early years of the century, while a teenager and presumably learning the shoemaking craft, Peter met another Dutch adolescent who became a shoemaker, Roland Johnson, or indeed Janssen, as he himself signed his name in the 1530s, who had recently moved to St. Martin's and who also became, as I mentioned earlier, a shoemaker. The two men formed a lifelong friendship. We know all these things about Peter Peterson's early life from later documents. He first appears in extant records only in the years shortly before Evil May Day in 1517. In 1514, at the age of 33 or so, he acquired the lease on a property called the Greyhound within the St. Martin's precinct on the west side of St. Martin's Lane, marked, of course, by the star on the map. At some point, he married a woman named Agnes, whom he would call well beloved at the end of his life in his will. As he had come to England when he was a child, he almost certainly met her in England. It's not clear if she was English or also Dutch, although the latter, I think, is more likely according to her own will's legacies, the names that she gives bequests to. Judging by their wills, Peter and Agnes had no children who survived into adulthood. Along with his neighbors, Peterson served as a coroner's inquest juror when a homicide happened in St. Martin's precinct in 1516. Though strangers couldn't be citizens of London or serve as jurors on local level civic courts, they could and did sit on the king's inquests when an incident took place in their own neighborhood. The Evil May Day riot must have had some kind of impact on Peterson, though we don't have any direct evidence about what that impact was. We do have some indirect, as we'll see. His workshop in the Greyhound tenement was steps away from where the Evil May Day rioters first congregated at about number 3 there on the map and began their violence. His shop may have been sacked by the rioters, though the records don't make that explicit. 5 of his neighbors on St. Martin's Lane, all pouchmakers, were instead the named victims in the subsequent prosecution of the riot. Whatever his experience of Evil May Day, it didn't make Peterson a staunch Anglophobe. Indeed, by the 1520s, then in his 40s, what evidence we have indicates instead Peterson's hostility towards recent Dutch migrants. Peterson and a number of other Dutch shoemakers in St. Martin's Lane were accused of swindling a new immigrant from Cologne named John Albertson in the late 1520s. In the years that followed the late 1520s, Peterson also became a thorn in the side of other stranger artisan neighbors, as we'll see. The roots of Peterson's enmities are irrecoverable, but it's worth speculating how those who migrated as children thought about themselves and their alienness in an environment of widespread xenophobia. New immigrants, such as Peterson's alleged swindling victim, John Albertson, who arrived in St. Martin's as adults and likely strongly signaled their strangeness, both linguistically and culturally, differed from those who had come to England as children. Peterson, aged 11 when he migrated, probably spoke unaccented English, I would guess, for instance, and likely barely remembered his life in the old country. Living in the St. Martin's precinct, he would also have continued to speak Dutch. Scholars of migration have long noted the in-betweenness of those who move when very young or who are second generation. They can code switch both linguistically and culturally with facility, positioning themselves situationally with an ease unavailable either to recent migrants or to the native born. If our evidence does not allow us to observe in detail the kinds of code switching in which Peterson might have engaged, we can see his pivots in the 1520s and 1530s between the Dutch artisanal community in St. Martin's and the English civic world of London. In 1527, around the time of the Albertson swindle, Peterson acquired the status of denizen, an alien-born person who renounced all other allegiances and became a subject of the English king. He also became involved in the late 1520s in the London Cordwainers or Shoemakers Guild. This latter move is curious because the Cordwainers were especial enemies of the Dutch shoemakers in St. Martin-le-Grand. From the 15th century until well into the early modern period, the Guild fought a long and mostly unsuccessful campaign on many fronts against the right of stranger shoemakers to make and sell shoes in the precinct. The cordwainers thus no doubt thought it a major coup to have a Dutch shoemaker with a shop on St. Martin's Lane voluntarily declaring himself to be under their warden's rule. It's less clear why Peterson would have been initially interested in joining up with the cordwainers. As I noted before, in theory, no one born outside the realm could be a full guild member in London, and in practice in the 1510s and 1520s, this rule was tightly enforced. Strangers, even if affiliated with a guild, couldn't have their own shops, but had to work as the subordinate of a master of the guild, and they couldn't sell their wares at retail. Peterson was a man in his 40s who had long run his own shoe shop in St. Martin's Lane. Why would he willingly submit to this inferiority? The answer is likely that promises were made and ultimately fulfilled that he wouldn't, in fact, have been inferior, for not long after affiliating with the guild, he did, in fact, become exceptionally a full member. In 1530, he was awarded citizenship of London by the mayor, aldermen, and common council upon the petition of the Cordwainers Guild. They explained, this starts on the verso of this opening, that he deserved this exceptional grant because of his labors against the problem of stranger workers in the city. Very soon after, Peterson became a warden of the guild, not just a foot soldier in the fight against St. Martin's, but a general. As warden of the Cordwainers, Peterson directly participated through the 1530s in a series of legal and political altercations, including sometimes violent raids on shops and seizure of merchandise between the Cordwainers Guild and the shoemakers of St. Martin's Lane. For Peterson, this harassment of the neighboring Dutch shops was both a way to declare clearly his loyalties to his craft guild and a rather convenient means to disadvantage neighbors and competitors to his own shoe shop. He continued to live until his death in St. Martin's Lane in the Greyhound tenement that he'd first leased in the 1510s. As a citizen cordwainer, he wasn't confined, as other Dutch shoemakers were, to working and selling within the precinct boundaries. He could have lived and set up shop anywhere in the city. Peterson seems to have positioned himself, actually, to take maximum advantage both of the privileges that accrued to guild membership and of his shop's situation in St. Martin's Lane, which was the best retail strip for shoes in the metropolis. In the 1534 tax rolls, his assessment of £60 in goods was more than respectable, but by 1541, his assessed wealth was a much more impressive £300, making him the wealthiest person in the precinct of St. Martin's by a significant margin. He remained an enthusiastic member of the Cordwainers Guild until his death in 1548. Both he and his wife, who died in 1555, left bequests to the guild. All this suggests that Peterson sided clearly against the interests of his fellow Dutchmen making shoes in St. Martin's Lane, except that other evidence indicates that he sided only against some of his fellow Dutch shoemakers. His continued residence in the Greyhound tenement suggests that St. Martin's Lane still felt like home to him. It mustn't have been always entirely comfortable. His victims also continued to live in St. Martin's Lane, steps from Peterson's tenement, making no doubt for some interesting daily encounters. Yet, notwithstanding likely hostility from some quarters, Peterson and his wife maintained strong social ties with certain other Dutch shoemakers and their families in the precinct. Peterson continued to hire Dutch servants in his shoemaking business. In his will, Peterson called his friend from his youth, Roland Johnson, his, quote, right trusty friend. Agnes Peterson similarly made a bequest of her best gown furred with gray and a hoop of gold to, quote, my gossip or best friend, Roland Johnson's wife. Other wills showed Peterson as close friend to several other Dutch shoemakers on St. Martin's Lane. Although we don't have enough evidence to map out fully the socio-political networks in St. Martin's, there's enough here to suggest a rift in the Dutch craftsman community in St. Martin's. Perhaps the lines of division were regional, Hollanders versus Brabanters. Maybe it was between those who were newcomers and those who were more established, or, and of course, all of these can be related, between those who desired more assimilation with and accommodation to English London structures and those who resisted integration. Peterson himself was evidently an assimilationist, but it's interesting to note that no matter how much Peterson might have looked or sounded like an Englishman, his stranger birth continued to matter in certain circumstances. The ambiguity and category confusion of an alien turned denizen turned citizen was especially obvious in Peterson's tax assessments. Such subsidies mandated by the Crown but assessed and collected by civic officials taxed aliens at a higher rate, usually double the English toll. The dichotomy of English and alien tax statuses meant pushing those with liminal positions, like Peterson, one way or another, but inconsistently. In the 1534 subsidy rolls, for instance, 4 years after Peterson had been granted citizenship, he was recorded amongst the English, the category here implicit rather than explicit. He was, however, labeled as a denizen, while the English remained unmarked. The strangers, as you can see towards the bottom of the entry, were marked as stranger. He paid the tax, however, at the English rather than the alien rate. So in a sense, he really is put into the English category in that sense. The record of his 1541 assessment was more ambiguous. Peterson was this time listed explicitly under the category of Englishmen rather than aliens, but again, as in 1534, the word denizen was added after his name. Peterson was the only taxpayer in St. Martin's identified by that label, denizen, although some of the others listed below him in the alien category had by that time also gained that same status. So for Peterson, his categorization as English, but with the label denizen, distinguished him on the one hand from the fully English, and on the other from the other strangers, whether or not they actually were denizens, presumably because he was different because he was a citizen. But unlike the 1534 assessment, and no doubt maddeningly for him, Peterson was assessed at the alien rate of 5% of his net worth, twice as much as the 2.5% the English paid. Given his substantial valuation of £300, this cost him an extra £7, 10 shillings. And for comparison, the average worker's annual earnings in 1541 were less than £5. Peterson's belonging in London then was situationally contingent, and it wasn't only fashioned by his own choices, actions, and identifications, but also determined by how others around him included or excluded him. To finish, I'd like to go back to 1517, to Evil May Day, when Peter Peterson would have been about 35 years old. As I've already noted, we don't know what Peterson experienced on that night or how he reacted. What we do know is that many of the residents of St. Martin's witnessed the subsequent punishment of the rioters, when at least 15 and perhaps as many as 43 boys and men were executed, some by the full traitor's death and others by simple hanging at 11 different sites around the city. At least 5 were executed in Cheapside, just around the corner from St. Martin-le-Grand, and 1 was put to death right outside the gates of St. Martin-le-Grand itself, perhaps 10 meters away from Peterson's tenement. A Sherman named James Anderson was there given the full traitor's execution of hanging, disemboweling, and quartering. Unsurprisingly, this graphic moment of public justice was remembered In the mid-1530s, 5 of Peterson's neighbors mentioned it in a Star Chamber inquiry about the boundaries of St. Martin's precinct, describing the setting up of the gallows before the south gate of St. Martin's and the execution of the rioter. The spectacular nature of the evil May Day executions was calculated to send a message to the London civic hierarchy, its guildsmen, and the apprentices who participated in the violence against stranger artisans in the city. The executions were also intended to assuage fears of European diplomats and wealthy stranger merchants, whom Henry VIII and his chief minister Wolsey thought would be mollified by the crown's swift and savage dealing with those who had threatened the king's allies. Although Dutch craft workers in St. Martin-le-Grand were the named victims in the prosecution that culminated in the rioters' executions, I don't think that the king particularly cared about them or especially intended to send them a message. This was a power move in a longer-term conflict between the crown and the city, and in the international world of diplomacy, in both of which the stranger artisans were pawns. Nonetheless, we might ask, if not be able to answer, how those Dutch artisans in St. Martin's reacted, not only to the riot itself, but to the executions afterwards. Such a crisis must have affected their sense of belonging in London. Perhaps some who witnessed the terrible execution of James Anderson felt vindication, even a sense that if many Londoners rejected them, at least the king protected their interests. Some may have been cynical and realistic enough to understand that the punishment of the rioters would not mark a permanent cessation of London craft workers' resentment and hostility, as indeed it didn't. And we know that the experience of the riot didn't prevent, and for all we know, perhaps catalyzed Peter Peterson's move in the 1520s to draw closer to, rather than harder demarcations from, the London guildsmen who had expressed such violent hostilities in 1517. Thank you.